When I look at the beginning of the message Paul sent to that turbulent and divided community, I perceive something that transcends time and speaks directly to the human heart. There is a point in life where strength, intelligence, experience, emotional strategies, and even the brilliance of gifts are not enough to sustain the soul. It is at this point, where everything we have built begins to crack, that the cross appears not as a religious symbol, but as divine intervention. And when Paul writes to that church, he doesn't praise their talents, although they were many. He comes with a truth that cuts like a smooth blade. You have gifts, you have knowledge, you have experience, but something essential is missing, something that no gift can replace. The inner depth that is only born when the cross occupies the place we previously gave to pride, comparisons, and human loyalties that divide us inside and out, is missing. And this realization, though harsh, is liberating. I imagine the first Christians in Corinth listening to these words on a sweltering night, gathered in simple homes, trying to reconcile their newfound faith with a city marked by glitz, commerce, fame, and sin. They lived surrounded by eloquent speeches, renowned philosophers, and powerful ideas that shaped the mentality of an entire society. However, there was a silent hunger within them, the same hunger that exists within us, a hunger for something that transcends the noise of the world and makes sense when everything around seems to crumble. Paul knew that to reach those people, he needed to expose the root of the problem. And the root was not a lack of gifts, nor a lack of spirituality, nor a lack of religious activity. The root was the absence of a heart centered on the cross, which dispels illusions and reorganizes the human being from within. In each of his sentences, I feel God revealing that true spirituality is not measured by what we do, but by what we surrender to. The way Paul dismantles the pride structure of that community is almost surgical. They were dividing themselves over names, styles, and personal preferences, as if faith had become a field of dispute and not a place of transformation. He denounces the root of this attitude, a heart that still seeks identity in people and not in Christ. A heart that wants to belong to a group and not to the kingdom. A heart that seeks acceptance in human leaders because it has not yet understood the depth of divine love. And when Paul asks if Christ is divided, I feel as if this question transcends every time and every generation. How many times, even without realizing it, do we divide Christ among our preferences, our spiritual vanities, our titles? How many times do we use his name to strengthen our own inner walls? And faced with this question, there is no possible argument. Only the silence that precedes repentance remains. The way Paul rejects the logic of spiritual self-promotion is so profound that it seems written for today. He states that he did not come with human wisdom, nor with brilliant speeches, because he did not want their faith to rest on something that could crumble. This is so counterintuitive that when I think about it, I realize how much we seek human solutions to spiritual problems. We try to balance the soul with rationalizations. We try to overcome sin with willpower. We try to heal inner wounds with external distractions. We try to hide feelings with masks that sooner or later begin to crumble. And when nothing works, God reminds us that the cross is the place where the human impossible meets the divine possible. There is no earthly wisdom that can replace the revelation of the Spirit. There is no emotional technique that can replace the touch of grace. There is no beautiful speech that can replace the power of Christ crucified. As I delve into the tone of this initial message, I realize that Paul is revealing a dynamic that governs the human soul. When we distance ourselves from the cross, we become divided. When we draw closer to the cross, we become united. The cross reorganizes priorities. dismantles illusions, heals insecurities, exposes pride, reveals hidden intentions, and restores coherence to what was fragmented. And when Paul says that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, I see how true this remains. The world calls foolishness that which heals the soul. The world prefers brilliant explanations to the silent touch of the Spirit. The world values spectacle, but God values sincerity. And the cross continues to be the meeting point between human weakness and divine strength, the only place where the soul finds the rest it has sought for so long. And while Paul states that God chose the weak things to confound the strong, I feel that something profound is revealed. Perhaps the greatest spiritual suffering is not being weak, but trying to appear strong all the time. Perhaps true slavery is maintaining an image that does not correspond to inner reality. Perhaps freedom begins precisely when we admit that we need God more than we imagined. The cross does not demand strength, it demands surrender. It does not demand knowledge, it demands humility. It does not demand perfection, it demands truth. And when this truth enters the heart, it disarms pride, melts resistance, and opens space for a transformation that is not born of effort, but of surrender. This is the hidden beauty of 1 Corinthians. Its strength lies not in criticism, but in healing, not in exposure, but in restoration, not in harshness, but in the grace that permeates everything. There are times when life leads us to such a silent point of spiritual exhaustion that we don't even realize we've crossed the border between human control and the absolute need for divine intervention. And when Paul describes his arrival in Corinth with weakness, fear, and trembling, I feel as if he is naming what many of us hide. The soul weary of carrying burdens it can no longer bear, the heart trembling before challenges that exceed its strength, the mind trying to appear firm while inside everything wavers. There is a profound beauty in admitting weakness before God, because it is precisely there that the cross becomes most real. It's as if Paul were saying, I didn't conquer Corinth with my skill. I survived because I abandoned all the strength that was solely mine. And this touches places within us that we rarely access. Those where we know that human wisdom is not enough to explain, heal, or transform what we feel. When I observe the culture of Corinth, filled with philosophy, intellectual debates, and impressive speeches, I perceive the contrast between what dazzles the eyes and what truly sustains the soul. Paul consciously chose not to compete with the standards of that world because he understood that God does not transform lives through the seduction of intelligence, but through the impact of truth. He knew that wise words can entertain, but only the cross can liberate. And this decision to reject human strength in order to reveal divine strength reveals something precious. Faith is not born when we master answers, but when we surrender to revelation. Human psychology attempts to explain pain. The cross redeems it. The mind seeks logic. God offers life. The soul seeks control. The spirit offers direction. And as I internalize this, I realize that there is nothing more liberating than letting go of the need to appear strong. The way Paul describes God's wisdom as a mystery reveals something that the modern soul still struggles to comprehend. He states that what God has prepared for us is hidden from natural eyes, inaccessible to human logic, unknown to the powerful of this world. It's as if spiritual truth exists on a plane the mind cannot enter alone, requiring something beyond cognitive capacity, requiring the spirit. This confronts the culture that has taught us to believe that intellectual understanding is the pinnacle of maturity. But Paul says no. There is a deeper, more intimate, more vibrant layer, and it only opens to the heart that accepts that it needs to be guided. And when he declares that the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God, I realize that there are dimensions of divine love, grace, wisdom, and healing that no study or argument can reach, only the revelation that springs from God into us. This revelation doesn't arrive like a spectacular lightning bolt, but like a breath that reorganizes our inner selves imperceptibly at first and irresistibly afterward. There are things we only understand when the Spirit illuminates. There are pains that only heal when the Spirit touches. There are decisions that only become clear when the Spirit reveals them. And it is precisely this point that Paul emphasizes. No one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God, and that same Spirit was given to us. This is such a profound truth that when we truly let it in, it changes our relationship with faith. We are not trying to reach God. He is the one who comes to us. We are not trying to decipher life alone. He is the one who shares his understanding. We are not trying to survive only with our own resources. He is the one who pours living wisdom upon the heart that opens itself, and this dismantles the anxiety of trying to be enough. When Paul differentiates between the natural man and the spiritual man, I feel as if he is describing two completely distinct ways of existing. The natural man lives limited by logic, interpreting life only by what his senses can perceive. Therefore, he does not recognize the value of spiritual things. Everything seems like madness to him because his perception is locked into the visible. But the spiritual man lives from another source, sees through the lens of revelation, understands through the touch of grace, discerns through the silent action of the Spirit. This is not a division between better and worse people, but between levels of spiritual consciousness. And when Paul says that we have the mind of Christ, I realize that he is not talking about intelligence, but about spiritual sensitivity, a disposition to perceive what God is doing, to feel what God is communicating, to discern what logic cannot reach. What impresses me most is realizing that Paul doesn't present this distinction as a theory, but as a call to abandon self-sufficiency, a call to recognize that the human heart needs more than answers. It needs direction. It needs light. It needs transformation. The natural mind tries to control life. The mind of Christ learns to trust. The natural mind tries to protect itself. The mind of Christ learns to surrender. The natural mind tries to understand first and then obey. The mind of Christ obeys and along the way understands. And when this awareness matures within us, we begin to realize that the Spirit is not just an external support, but the very presence that sustains us when all other forms of wisdom fail. There are moments in the spiritual journey when we realize that the greatest enemy is not visible temptation, nor external persecution, nor even the suffering that tries to steal our hope, but rather that subtle immaturity that settles in the heart and begins to corrode from the inside out. When Paul says that he could not speak to those people as spiritual beings, but as carnal beings, I perceive a deep pain in the subtext, a pain that does not stem from judgment, but from frustrated love. He saw them as a community full of gifts, full of potential, full of spiritual brilliance, but still incapable of sustaining the depth that God wanted to reveal. It's like looking at a tree full of leaves, but unable to bear fruit because its roots are still shallow. And this image touches something profoundly human, the feeling that although we have walked a long way, we still stumble in the same places, we still react as before. We still carry attitudes that betray an unresolved spiritual infancy. The way Paul describes those people reveals something we often prefer to ignore. They had gifts, but lacked maturity. They spoke in tongues, but didn't know how to handle conflict. They prophesied, but hurt each other. They knew theology, but still lived guided by disordered emotions. This contradiction is so relevant today that it seems the letter was written yesterday. The psychology of the soul shows exactly that. It's not how much we know that defines our growth, but how much we can transform knowledge into inner life. We can accumulate information and still remain trapped by the same insecurities, the same comparisons, the same fears that have always accompanied us. And when Paul calls them babes in Christ, I understand that he is not diminishing anyone. He is pointing to where growth stopped, and when growth stops, the heart begins to sicken. The description of the quarrels, jealousies, and divisions reveals that spiritual immaturity almost never manifests itself as something grand or visible. It manifests itself in small details, in hidden irritations, in silent comparisons, in conversations that try to prove something, in guarded resentments that begin as tiny seeds but transform into walls that divide and weaken. Paul is dealing with a people who have transformed difference into rivalry, novelty into pride, leadership into a banner. And this happens whenever the heart loses focus on the cross. The cross levels everyone, heals vanities, undoes internal disputes, realigns motivations. But without it, each one tries to build their own emotional pedestal. And these pedestals sooner or later crumble because they were not made to sustain souls, only egos. The metaphor of planting deeply touches me. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gives the growth. This phrase is a key that opens many inner doors. First, because it reminds us that no one is the source of anything. We are merely instruments. Second, because it reveals that each stage of God's work has a different rhythm and a different person responsible. And third, because it shows that spiritual growth never happens through comparison, but through surrender. Pride makes the soul demand rapid growth. Maturity makes the soul trust in God's timing. Pride demands recognition. Maturity recognizes that everything belongs to God. And when Paul puts each leader in their proper place, dismantling any attempt to idolize people, I feel he is protecting the church from something very common, the human tendency to seek in others what only God can offer. The image of the building amplifies this truth even more intensely. Paul says that they laid a solid foundation, Christ, but that each one builds upon this foundation with different materials. And when he mentions fire, he doesn't speak of destruction, but of revelation. Fire reveals what is authentic, what was built with sincerity, what was born from a surrendered heart, and also reveals what was born of pride, insecurity, and the desire for approval. This metaphor strikes deeply because it shows that God is not interested in quantity but in quality. He's not impressed by appearance, but by essence. Spiritual authenticity cannot be manufactured, and upon realizing this, the heart begins to seek more purity and less performance. It begins to desire more presence and less showmanship. The statement that we are the temple of God's Spirit is perhaps one of the most transformative truths of this message. We are not merely vessels, we are dwelling places. We do not merely carry God's ideas, we carry His presence. And when I realize this, everything becomes more serious and more sacred. There are thoughts I stop nurturing because they don't belong in a temple. There are feelings I stop harboring because they don't belong in this holy place. There are attitudes I stop repeating because they wound what God has sanctified. Spiritual immaturity is not just inappropriate behavior, it is treating the temple as if it were ordinary. And when Paul warns that destroying this temple brings consequences, I understand that he is not speaking of punishment, but of a spiritual principle. What we do not protect, we lose. What we do not cultivate, weakens. What we do not honor, distances itself. There are moments in spiritual life when God uses leadership not to impress us, but to reveal us. And when Paul writes about how he and Apollos should be seen, not as spiritual celebrities, but as servants, I feel he is touching on the root of a problem that is not limited to Corinth, but spans centuries. The human soul has an almost desperate need to lean on visible references, on strong people, on voices that seem secure, as if we were transferring to them a responsibility that is, in the end, ours. But Paul dismantles this fantasy with words as simple as they are profound. He says that a leader is merely a steward of something that belongs entirely to God. This dismantles the search for spiritual idols and confronts the tendency to project onto leaders what we do not assume before the Lord. And reading this, I realize that many times we do not idolize people because of them, but because of the emptiness we feel within ourselves. When he states that he doesn't even judge himself and that only God fully knows the heart, a bright light shines on our own tendency to distort our self-perception. We can judge ourselves harshly for reasons that God has already erased, just as we can exalt ourselves for attitudes that he doesn't value. Paul reveals a healing principle. Human judgment, whether our own or that of others, is never entirely fair because it never sees everything. This truth is especially therapeutic because it frees us from the need to please others' expectations and the anxiety of conforming to unreal images. The soul that lives, trying to be validated by the gaze of others, becomes increasingly fragmented. The one that submits to God's gaze finds rest. It's as if Paul were saying, you don't need to be seen by men, you need to be seen by God. And this, when absorbed, heals areas of the soul that have carried weight for years. The painful irony Paul uses when saying they already considered themselves rich and reigning reveals an emotional mechanism that still exists today, a triumphalist spirituality that uses words of faith to avoid facing deep weaknesses. They behaved as if they had reached a higher spiritual level, as if they were already at the top of a journey that, in reality, was only just beginning. This illusion is dangerous because it prevents humility, and without humility, there is no true growth. Christian psychology shows that when someone sees themselves as greater than they really are, they are actually trying to cover up a hidden feeling of inadequacy. Arrogance is often the cloak of insecurity, and Paul tears away this cloak not to expose but to heal. While they lived like kings, Paul lived like a servant. While they sought glory, Paul carried scars. While they sought applause, Paul sought Christ. Paul's description of his own life is so raw and real that it hits the reader like an unexpected blow. He says that the apostles were treated like the scum of the earth, as a public spectacle for angels and men, as those who suffer while others exalt themselves. And this image generates a profound confrontation in the soul, because it shows that following Christ was never a journey of comfort, but of surrender. Authentic spiritual leadership is not measured by followers, but by sacrifices, not by applause, but by faithfulness, not by status, but by the ability to continue loving, even when there is no return. This exposition does not romanticize suffering, but reveals that Christian glory is never where the world places it. True greatness lies in the humility that remains when everyone expects pride, in the meekness that remains when everyone expects resistance, in the perseverance that remains when everything within us begs us to give up. And then a profoundly human moment emerges. Paul says he is not writing to shame, but to warn as beloved children. The power of this phrase is indescribable. It reveals that all true confrontation is born of love, not superiority. A spiritual father does not correct to show power, but to restore identity. He reminds them that it was through his proclamation of the gospel that those Christians were born into faith, and therefore he felt a paternal responsibility towards them. This stance has nothing to do with authoritarianism. It is pure care. It reveals that God also corrects us in this way, not with an accusing finger, but with hands that lift up, not with shame, but with truth that liberates, not with harshness, but with loving firmness. And reading this, I feel that the soul is called to surrender, not to a human leader, but to the God who uses leaders to heal what we cannot see on our own. When Paul mentions sending Timothy, there is something profoundly intimate about it. Timothy was not just a messenger. He was someone who carried Paul's heart, someone formed in practice, someone who had seen firsthand how a man truly guided by Christ lives. It wasn't just teaching, it was witnessing. This reveals a powerful spiritual truth. What transforms is not only what we hear, but what we see embodied in someone who lives what they preach. Corinth needed not just correction, but guidance, not just words, but examples. The human soul learns more through observation than instruction. And when I think about this, I realize how God places people around us who, without us realizing it, shape our way of loving, forgiving, serving, and walking with Christ. They are living mirrors that God uses to remind us who we should become. There are times when God's light enters areas we prefer to keep hidden, and when that happens, nothing remains the same. The situation Paul describes is so intense that it reveals not only the sin of an individual, but the silent condition of an entire community. The church was tolerating something that even pagans knew to be destructive, and the most frightening thing was not the act itself, but the indifference. The human soul is in danger not only when it errs, but when it loses the capacity to grieve for the error. And when I read Paul's words, I feel that he is dealing not only with a moral failing, but with a spiritual anesthesia, the kind that makes the conscience heavy yet quiet, the kind that makes us call peace what is in fact complacency, the kind that teaches us to live with what should break us. Nothing destroys as deeply as a sin nurtured in the shadow of a heart that prefers not to confront it. The pride Paul mentions is a mirror many avoid looking into. How could a community full of gifts, vibrant in spiritual expression, be so blind to the moral decay growing within it? The answer is painfully simple. When spirituality becomes a spectacle, it loses sensitivity. They boasted perhaps of their maturity or their freedom or their inclusiveness, but this posture was not grace, it was masked arrogance. The psychology of the soul shows that pride often arises in areas where we feel vulnerable. By avoiding confronting sin, the Corinthians protected themselves from something deeper, the fear of appearing less spiritual than they considered themselves. And this fueled a collective blindness that contaminated the community, like silent leaven that acts when no one is looking. Paul does not denounce out of harshness, but out of love, because he knows that the soul that prides itself on what it should lament is far more wounded than it imagines. When he orders the man to be removed from that environment, he speaks not as a judge thirsting for punishment, but as a doctor who knows that the infection needs to be isolated for the body to survive. This decision may seem extreme in modern eyes, but it reveals a spiritual principle that we have great difficulty accepting. Untreated sin destroys not only the one who practices it, but all who live with him. The discipline that Paul proposes is drastic because the risk was devastating. And the objective, surprisingly, is not destruction, but salvation. He desires that the flesh, the selfish, impulsive, and rebellious layer, be broken so that the spirit may awaken. It is a painful process, but profoundly redemptive. There are pains that God allows not to punish us, but to heal us from what we have not yet been able to abandon. And in realizing this, I understand that spiritual discipline is an extreme act of love, not of rejection. The metaphor of leaven illuminates something essential about the soul. A little inner disorder may seem harmless at first, but it grows almost invisibly. A small concession becomes a habit becomes a pattern becomes a prison. The Corinthian community did not realize that it was being shaped by what it tolerated. And this truth echoes throughout the ages. What you silently allow shapes you in the dark. There is no neutrality in the human heart. It's always being formed by what it embraces or ignores. Paul calls the church to remove the old leaven because he understands that holiness is not a rigid posture, but an environment where the soul can breathe without being suffocated by internal contaminations. Christ, the Passover lamb, came not only to forgive, but to liberate, and liberation demands sincerity. There is a point in this message that reveals impressive emotional wisdom. Paul says that his guidance does not apply to outsiders, but to insiders. He understands something that many Christians have forgotten. The world does not live by the standards of the kingdom, and demanding that is merely hypocrisy disguised as morality. The call to purity is not a cross placed upon others, but an invitation for the community to live the truth it proclaims. The judgment that Paul mentions is not condemnation, but responsibility. It is not to destroy the other, but to carry them back to the path before it is too late. And this directly confronts the current tendency to relativize everything in the name of misunderstood love. Love that does not confront, does not heal. Acceptance that ignores wounds only prolongs suffering. Mercy without truth becomes permissiveness. Truth without mercy becomes cruelty. Spiritual healing always arises from the perfect fusion between both. In the end, I realize that Paul is calling that community and calling us to an awakening. He reminds us that holiness is not a list of behaviors, but a condition of the heart. It is the inner space where God dwells. It is the alignment between what we live and what we believe. When a community loses the courage to confront sin, it also loses the capacity to love deeply, because to love is to protect, and to protect is sometimes to say what hurts. The restoration that Paul seeks is not the expulsion of the sinner, but the return of the Son. He sees beyond the fall. He sees the possibility of reconciliation. And this transforms everything because it reveals that God does not expose to humiliate, but to save, does not discipline to reject, but to rebuild, does not confront to distance, but to bring back to the center that which was being lost in silence. There are situations in spiritual life where God allows external conflicts to reveal internal cracks that have been there for a long time. The fact that those brothers took each other to pagan courts was not just a practical mistake, but an alarming sign of a fragmented heart, incapable of understanding the greatness of the identity received in Christ. By choosing to be judged by people who did not share their faith, they expose something much deeper. The soul that forgets who it is begins to seek validation anywhere, even in systems that do not carry the truth that should guide it. The conflict that seemed legal was, in fact, emotional and spiritual. It revealed hidden insecurities, unconfessed desires, and a desperate need to win, even if it cost fellowship. When Paul speaks about this behavior, he points not only to the actions, but to the root that fuels these gestures. A heart that has traded maturity for dispute and identity for competition. The truth is that the soul that has not found rest in God always feels threatened. Therefore, it needs to prove itself, defend itself, conquer, demand. And the courts of Corinth were merely the stage where these internal conflicts became visible. By questioning why they didn't prefer to be wronged rather than cause public scandal, Paul reveals a spiritual logic that directly confronts human logic. For the world, winning is what matters. For God, it is humility that reveals who we truly are. This inversion reveals the depth of the Christian faith. Those who are secure in Christ do not need to win every dispute because they have already received the greatest victory, that of the cross. But the soul that does not rest in this truth fights tooth and nail for crumbs of human justice, as if its identity lay there. This frantic search reveals a deep pain, the fear of losing something that in essence should not define the soul. In presenting the list of sins that prevent someone from inheriting the kingdom, Paul doesn't create a category of condemned individuals, but exposes the kind of life that arises when the soul disconnects from the purpose for which it was created. Every form of immorality, greed, idolatry, abuse, falsehood, and destruction stems from a heart that tries to fill itself with what cannot satisfy it. This list, instead of pointing fingers, functions as a mirror. It shows the destructive tendencies that hide when we stop prioritizing God. But Paul does something extraordinary. He reminds us that many of them had been exactly like that. Lost, broken, confused, but were washed, sanctified, and justified. This transition reveals that the Christian life is not built on performances, but on transformation, not on reputation, but on redemption. Grace doesn't cover up who we were. It recreates us to be who God always saw us as. When Paul speaks of the body as the temple of the Spirit, he elevates human dignity to a level we rarely fully comprehend. The body is not merely matter, it is a dwelling place. The Spirit does not inhabit temples made by human hands, but dwells in every person who belongs to Christ. This reality confronts the distorted view of the Corinthians, who treated the body as an instrument of pleasure, a disposable tool, or a space without spiritual importance. By declaring that we were bought at a price, Paul reveals the value that God places on each life. The body that many despise is the same one that Christ chooses to inhabit. The body that some use irresponsibly is the same one that God calls a temple. When the soul understands this, all practice changes, because one no longer lives to satisfy desires, but to express the presence of the one who dwells within us. This message also reveals a profound psychological aspect. When someone doesn't recognize their own worth before God, they tend to use their body in a self-destructive or reckless way. Immorality in this context is not just an act, but a symptom. It's a desperate search for belonging, validation, pleasure, or relief in places that cannot fill the deepest void in the soul. God doesn't just condemn the behavior, He heals the origin. He doesn't just point out the error, He reveals the lost identity. When Paul says that the body belongs to God, he is calling us not to a prohibition, but to a healing, the healing of those who finally know they are loved, protected, and inhabited by the Spirit. Sexual sin, then, ceases to be just a moral list and becomes a distortion of what God designed to be holy, beautiful, and full of purpose. Ultimately, the message that resonates is this: we are not masters of ourselves. This phrase, for many, sounds like a loss of freedom, but in reality, it is its birth, because when we belong to ourselves, we are slaves to our impulses, desires, traumas, and needs. But when we belong to Christ, the soul finds an axis, a north star, an anchor. There, emptiness finally finds rest, pain finds meaning, the body finds purpose, life finds direction. The call to purity is not to suffocate the soul, but to free it from the chains it doesn't even realize it carries. And as I read each word of this exhortation, I understand that God is not only teaching us to live better, He is teaching us to live in a whole, healed, aligned, and deeply conscious way, aware of the value we carry. There are periods in life when the soul finds itself divided between what it desires and what God is calling it to live. And it is in this territory of tension that Paul reveals a wisdom that transcends centuries. When he speaks about marriage, singleness, separation, reconciliation, and life within imperfect relationships, he is not only offering moral rules, but a profound emotional map on how to discern human desires from divine will. The soul desires stability, affection, and belonging, but also freedom, purpose, and focus. And often, these two worlds seem to clash. Paul does not ignore this complexity. He walks within it with impressive sensitivity. He knows that the human heart is a mixture of desire and fragility, and therefore presents an essential truth. What we choose in moments of emotional confusion can lead us away from the purpose that God is silently designing within us. The Corinthians lived surrounded by extreme philosophies. On one side, rigid asceticism, on the other, libertinism disguised as spiritual freedom. And Paul exposes that neither of these paths produces true wisdom. When he says it is good not to touch a woman, he is not sanctifying abstinence as a rule, but speaking of an emotional and spiritual context marked by pressures, persecutions, and crises that demanded absolute focus. This statement reveals something profound about the human heart. There are times when our desires are legitimate, but not opportune. There are times when God does not deny what we want, but asks us to postpone it, because what is being built within us requires silence, attention, and a surrender that the noise of passions does not allow. Paul understands that marriage is beautiful, holy, and necessary, but he also knows that it brings responsibilities that can displace the soul when it is being called to a station of depth. This wisdom is not to restrict, but to liberate. It teaches that spiritual maturity does not consist in satisfying every desire, but in discerning when a desire is in conflict with the rhythm of God's work. And this is something that most do not admit. Sometimes, the heart insists on something that the soul is not yet ready to bear. The guidance on marital duty, when read superficially, seems technical, but in reality, it is a profound lesson about vulnerability and emotional surrender. Paul says that one's body belongs to the other, and this statement reveals a spiritual mystery about intimacy that goes far beyond the physical dimension. It shows that marriage is not just a union of bodies, but a fusion of histories, fears, expectations, and fragilities. The reciprocity it demands is, in fact, a cure against selfishness. When a couple closes themselves off emotionally, the body becomes merely a territory of dispute. When they surrender emotionally, the body becomes a territory of healing. Paul is not talking about cold rules, but about how the soul sustains itself within a commitment. He knows that depriving the other fuels silent resentments, destructive fantasies, and emotional distances that over time destroy what was once a promise. His instruction is, above all, therapeutic. The body is not an instrument of punishment, but a space where love should be realized. And when this is practiced, the soul finds security. The advice not to separate, but to seek reconciliation if separation occurs, reveals a profound understanding of the psychology of grief. Separations never begin at the moment they happen. They are born much earlier, in the small ruptures of the soul, in prolonged silences, in ignored feelings, in frustrated expectations that accumulate until they become unbearable. Paul does not treat divorce as a taboo, but as a consequence. He understands that relationships break down not for lack of love, but for lack of care. His instruction is not a rigid moral rule, but an invitation to restoration, not because it is easy, but because the soul that tries to rebuild learns something about itself that it would not learn anywhere else. Reconciliation, when possible, is a journey of humility, forgiveness, and renunciation of pride, something that heals not only the bond, but also the individual. And even when it doesn't happen, the call to inner responsibility remains, not to flee, but to understand. Not to blame, but to mature. The most surprising part is when Paul addresses marriage between believers and unbelievers. He contradicts the religious impulse to sever ties and with divine depth reveals that the presence of a child of God within a home has real spiritual power. The word sanctification here doesn't speak of automatic salvation, but of influence. It shows that the behavior of a righteous person within a home establishes an environment that God can transform. This heals the soul of those who carry the weight of an unequal relationship because it reveals that God doesn't abandon difficult environments. He acts within them. But Paul also recognizes emotional limits. If the unbeliever doesn't want to stay, let them go. It's not a sentence, but a liberation. The soul wasn't made to live in daily warfare, and God calls for peace, not destructive wear and tear. This shows that Christianity is not a system that imprisons, but one that guides with balance, sensitivity, and realism. From there, Paul offers a key that completely changes the way we see life. Each person must remain in the condition in which they were called. This phrase seems simple, but it carries immense spiritual weight. It teaches that God does not begin his work when we change our situation. He begins exactly where we are. The soul, however, tends to believe that it will only be happy when something external changes. Marital status, financial condition, routine, past, body, work. But Paul reveals that this search is illusory. Contentment is not born from new circumstances, but from a new perception. When someone finds purpose in the place where they are, something inside stabilizes. Anxiety diminishes. Comparison loses its power. The heart learns to value the exact point where God planted it. And this awareness frees the soul from one of the greatest emotional prisons, the expectation that happiness is always somewhere else. The perspective on singles and widows reveals another layer of depth. Paul doesn't exalt singleness as superior, but as an opportunity. He knows that there are phases in life where solitude, instead of being a burden, becomes fertile ground for profound revelations. The silence that many fear is the very place where God speaks most clearly. The responsibilities that don't exist at this stage become space to serve, grow, and immerse oneself in God's presence without distractions. And this doesn't diminish the value of marriage. It only reveals that each season has its purpose. The mature soul doesn't idolize any of them. It embraces each with gratitude and balance. When someone understands this, they stop fighting against their own story and begin to cooperate with what God is doing in the depths of their heart. There are times when God allows the freedom we have to reveal what is really going on inside us. And when Paul addresses the issue of meat sacrificed to idols, we realize that the problem wasn't the meat nor the idol, but the attitude of the heart. The knowledge that some Corinthians possessed made them feel superior, as if they were on a spiritual level above others. They knew that idols had no power, that nothing could contaminate them, that their faith was mature, and precisely for that reason they used this freedom as a shield to avoid perceiving the impact they had on the souls of the more sensitive. The freedom that God gives us should serve to liberate others, but they used it to create distance. This behavior exposes a deep emotional dynamic. When the soul prides itself on what it knows, it fails to perceive whom it hurts while exercising its freedom. And Paul unmasks this with a phrase that transcends the ages: knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. He doesn't criticize knowledge itself, but the pride that silently arises when the soul confuses information with maturity and skill with holiness. The tension between the strong and the weak was not a theological dispute, but an emotional one. The strong were so enamored of their own understanding that they failed to perceive the fragility of their brothers and sisters who had grown up amidst idolatry and still carried the marks of the past. For them, eating sacrificed meat was not just food, it was memory, it was fear, it was a trigger, it was a shadow. When they saw a mature Christian sitting at the table in a pagan temple, something within them was shaken. And Paul reveals something that few spiritual leaders understand. Maturity is not measured by what you can do, but by what you are willing not to do for the love of others. The truly strong soul does not need to prove its strength. It adapts, renounces, becomes flexible, and molds itself to the rhythm of the weaker ones, because it understands that the formation of a community does not depend on who knows more, but on who loves more deeply. And this truth confronts even today the spiritual pride disguised as freedom. When Paul states that food doesn't make anyone better or worse, he is removing any moral significance from the act itself. But at the same time, he exposes the true point. It's not about what you do, but about how your action affects the heart of someone for whom Christ died. This awareness elevates spiritual responsibility to an almost disconcerting level. We don't live in isolation. Every gesture we make shapes someone around us. An act of freedom can become an instrument of emotional destruction for someone insecure. Christ died for the weak, but the strong, by insisting on their right, can hurt them. This is the depth of the Christian faith. The freedom we receive is only complete when used for the benefit of others. And this dismantles the modern idea of absolute autonomy, revealing that the soul that perceives itself as part of the body does not allow itself to live individualistically. Faith is not only vertical, it is relational. It is not enough to be right before God. It is necessary to be careful before people. The decisive point arises when Paul states that by wounding a weak brother, the strong sin against Christ. This statement is an immense spiritual milestone. It shows that Jesus identifies so deeply with his followers that any wound against one of them is a wound against him. This changes the way we see each person around us. We no longer see just an individual, but a life that carries the value of Christ's blood. The anxiety to demonstrate our freedom loses strength in the face of this revelation. The desire to show maturity crumbles. The impulse to prove that we know more empties out. When the soul understands that each brother is an extension of Christ himself, it spontaneously chooses the path of renunciation, not out of obligation, but out of love, not out of moral pressure, but out of spiritual reverence. And it is this reverence that is lacking when freedom becomes a stage for vanity. Paul does not call the Corinthians to the slavery of others' opinions, but to the sensitivity of love that protects even what it does not fully understand. The conclusion of this reflection brings one of the strongest and most beautiful resolutions in the entire letter. The declaration that if what is lawful for Paul causes his brother to stumble, then he completely renounces it. This phrase reveals the essence of a truly converted heart. It is not religious abstentionism that deprives oneself to appear pure, but loving renunciation that deprives oneself to preserve the other. It is the maturity that understands that some personal victories need to be sacrificed so that others may find strength. It is the understanding that freedom is not an absolute right, but a spiritual tool given by God to build lives, not to display independence. The soul that reaches this place does not need to prove anything to anyone. It finds rest in the awareness that pleasing God is more precious than any public affirmation. And when an entire community embraces this stance, a type of church is born that the world cannot ignore. A church where love is worth more than rights, where edification is worth more than opinion, and where sensitivity is worth more than knowledge. There are times when God confronts us not with what we lack, but with what we consider our legitimate right. And when Paul speaks of his rights as an apostle, he is not trying to explain why he deserves something. He's exposing something much deeper: the way the human soul deals with power, recognition, and reward. We all, at some level, carry within us the expectation of being valued, rewarded, and respected. The soul desires to be seen. The soul desires to be recognized. But Paul dismantles this emotional structure by relinquishing everything that was due to him. He could have demanded sustenance, honor, recognition, and support, and all of that would have been just. But he chose the path of voluntary renunciation. This renunciation does not stem from weakness, but from a spiritual strength that few can comprehend. The soul that rests in God does not compete for resources. It reveals trust. The soul that understands its mission is not distracted by its rights. It remains focused on its purpose. And this profoundly confronts the human tendency to build identity from what one receives, not from what one gives. When Paul compares his ministry to that of a soldier, a farmer, or a shepherd who naturally enjoys the fruits of their own labor, he is not claiming privileges, but showing that if he wanted to, he could do so based on the logic of everyday life. Even so, he renounces them. It's as if he were saying, I don't need to use my rights to validate my calling. Sedito, this phrase is a blow to human pride. How many times do we want to prove that we are worthy? How many times do we expect someone to notice the effort we make? How many times are we frustrated because we feel we give more than we receive? The soul clings to the expectation of recognition and suffers when it doesn't come. But Paul reveals an adult, mature spirituality that has learned to be sustained not by what it receives from people, but by what it receives from God in secret. He does not deny his rights, he places them below purpose. This is a stance that few souls manage to adopt because it requires dying to vanity, to ego, and to the need for validation. By stating, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel," Paul shows that his mission is not born from feeling, but from conviction. He does not preach because it is comfortable. He preaches because he is called. He does not serve because he is rewarded. He serves because he is transformed. This truth reveals something powerful about the psychology of the soul. A solid purpose generates a stable identity. When someone knows why they exist, they don't need to fight for space. When someone understands their calling, they don't need to compete for relevance. Insecurity arises when purpose is fragile. Envy arises when identity is poorly established. Comparison arises when the soul still depends on applause to feel alive. But the soul that rests in purpose finds freedom even to relinquish what it would be right to claim. Paul embraces renunciation as part of the mission because he understands that any extra weight could hinder the flow of the work God called him to do. The most profound moment arises when he states that he has made himself a servant of all. This declaration is not poetry, it is deconstruction. Serving is not natural. The human soul desires control, autonomy, protagonism. It desires to be served, not to serve. But Paul discovers that spiritual effectiveness lies precisely in descending, not in ascending. He becomes a servant not out of inferiority, but through divine strategy. Serving opens doors that pride closes. Serving accesses hearts that imposition drives away. Serving generates trust where demands would generate resistance. He becomes like a Jew to win Jews, like a Gentile to win Gentiles, like the weak to win the weak. This capacity for adaptation is not a lack of identity, but a depth of love. The soul that knows itself does not fear to make its approach more flexible. It does not lose its essence when approaching others. It reveals Christ. True maturity does not fear descending because it knows that its dignity does not depend on position, but on the presence of God within it. The analogy of the race and the athlete brings to light the disciplinary aspect of spiritual life. Paul knows that to fulfill the calling, the soul needs to learn to say no to itself. And this is one of the most intense struggles of the Christian, disciplining one's own heart, denying impulses, taming desires, redirecting emotions, restricting wills, training perceptions. The undisciplined soul becomes a hostage to its own sensations. The disciplined soul becomes an instrument of God. Paul does not run without direction. He does not fight against the wind. He knows exactly where he is going. And this clarity is born from renunciation. Whoever does not renounce what hinders them never discovers what really matters. This text shows that the soul, when it does not learn discipline, confuses freedom with chaos and right with priority. But the trained soul recognizes that not everything it can do should be done. Freedom without purpose destroys. Freedom with purpose builds. The conclusion reveals a truth that deeply affects those who serve God. Even those who preach can disqualify themselves if they do not watch over themselves. This is one of Paul's strongest statements. He understands that the greatest battle is not against the world nor against opinions, but against one's own heart. The soul that does not observe itself slowly loses itself, without perceptions, without alarms, without noticing that it has distanced itself from the purpose that once burned within it. Paul lives vigilantly because he knows that the greatest enemy of the mission is not external persecution, but internal complacency. He does not fear losing status. He fears losing sensitivity. He does not fear losing resources. He fears losing focus. He does not fear losing rights. He fears losing the presence of God. And this holy fear is what keeps his life effective, aligned, and fully aware that everything, absolutely everything, must bow before the purpose that called him. There are moments in the spiritual journey when God compels us to look at stories that are not our own, only to reveal aspects of our hearts that we would never admit if we didn't see them reflected in another life. When Paul recounts Israel's journey in the desert, he is not simply recalling past events. He is holding up a gigantic mirror before the church, where each of the people's past actions becomes an exact description of tendencies that still dwell within us. They had the cloud, they had the open sea, they had the spiritual rock, they had Christ himself walking with them in mystery. And yet they fell. This profoundly confronts the modern soul that believes intense spiritual experiences are enough to keep it steadfast. The text reveals that it is not how much God manifests himself, but how much the heart responds. The soul can be surrounded by miracles and still die of thirst. The heart can be full of revelations and still wander in rebellion. The story of Israel exposes not only a people, it exposes human frailty before a perfect God. When Paul speaks about idolatry, what he is really exposing is the intimate mechanism of inner deviation. Idolatry is not just bowing down before a statue, it is allowing anything to become more attractive than the voice of God. And this can happen silently, without temples, without rituals, without ceremonies. The soul creates idols when it places desires above obedience, opinions above truth, feelings above divine guidance. The golden calf, in this sense, is not an object of the past, but an eternal symbol of human anxiety to control one's own faith. The people could not bear to wait for Moses and built a god they could manipulate. How often do we do the same? How often do we try to reinterpret God's will to fit our own impulses? Idolatry is the kind of sin that is born of haste, grows in impatience, and takes root in the need for autonomy. And Paul exposes this with surgical precision so that no soul hides behind the excuse of loving God, while secretly feeding its own inner altars. The immorality mentioned by Paul is not merely a physical act, but a state of the soul that surrenders to desire without considering purpose. The episode of the Moabite women reveals that the fall did not occur solely through pleasure, but through the rupture of spiritual identity. Whenever the soul disconnects from who it is in God, it becomes vulnerable to any offer that provides quick gratification. This type of sin takes root subtly, almost imperceptibly, when we stop guarding our thoughts, when we normalize what once broke us, when we draw our hearts close to what should repel us. Immorality is always a symptom, never the root. It is born from an unresolved need, from an unstrengthened faith, from a neglected intimacy with God. Paul is not pointing out human failings to humiliate. He is exposing the spiritual strategy behind the deepest falls of the soul. He knows that the enemy rarely attacks with force. He seduces with gentleness. And it is in this gentleness that entire lives are lost. When he mentions those who put God to the test and were destroyed by serpents, the narrative takes on an important psychological tone. Testing God is the same as demanding that he conform to our expectations. And this is one of the most common temptations of the soul. We want signs, we want guarantees, we want confirmations before obeying. The doubting soul is not the one that does not believe, but the one that only believes when God acts in the way it desires. To test God is to demand spiritual control. It is to live faith by the logic of merit. If God does this, I follow. If he does not, I retreat. Paul exposes that this type of attitude is not innocent doubt, but masked rebellion. The heart that puts God to the test is, in fact, trying to place him in an inferior position, becoming the judge of that same hand that sustains it. And this type of posture not only wounds faith, it wounds the soul. It creates a deep void, because faith ceases to be a relationship and becomes a transaction. Murmuring, in turn, is perhaps the most silent and, at the same time, the most destructive sin. Murmuring is not complaining about the world, but complaining against God. It is the language of the soul that has lost the ability to see grace in the desert. It is the inner voice that ignores what has been received and focuses only on what is lacking. Murmuring is transforming the heart into a field of scarcity, even when God is sending manna every day. And this emotional state generates a slow, constant, dangerous spiritual corrosion. When someone murmurs, something inside slowly dies, hope weakens, faith becomes gray, vision becomes blurred, and the heart loses sensitivity to recognize the divine presence. Paul mentions the destruction that came upon the murmurers because he knows that murmuring is not a venting of frustration, but a deviation. It is not a complaint, but a disconnection, and whoever disconnects gets lost. Not because God abandons them, but because they stop seeing the God who has always been there. The final warning, "Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall," is not a threat but a cure. It reveals that the fall never begins in weakness, but in self-confidence. The soul falls when it believes it will not fall. The danger lies not in temptation, but in pride. Self-confidence is the abyss that opens at the feet of those who believe they have matured enough not to be shaken. Paul reminds us that vigilance is the only safe posture. He who watches does not fear. He only recognizes his dependence. He who watches does not live anxiously. He lives attentively. He who watches does not live in paranoia. He lives in humility. Spiritual downfall is not the result of the enemy's attack, but of the soul's slumber. It is when we stop examining our hearts, when we abandon sensitivity, when we confuse past experiences with present strength. And it is at this point that Paul calls us to awaken. He knows that the soul that considers itself unshakable has already begun to crumble from within. He knows that pride precedes the fall because it steals what keeps the Christian standing: total dependence on God. There are times when God chooses to confront not what we do, but why we do it. And when Paul addresses posture within worship, both in appearance and in communion, he is not dealing with external traditions, but with a much deeper inner phenomenon: the soul's tendency to transform sacred moments into personal showcases. Worship, which should be an expression of surrender, becomes a stage for vanity. The gathering that should reveal Christ ends up revealing internal disputes. The spiritual drama here is not in the veil, the appearance, or the food, but in the soul's inability to understand that worship is disappearing before the glory of God. When Paul affirms that there is an order established by God, he is restoring something that the modern soul struggles to accept. Worship is not built on personal preferences, but on a divine principle that establishes humility, reverence, and understanding. The soul that enters the worship environment seeking self-affirmation will never find rest, because every pursuit of self-promotion within God's presence generates frustration, resistance, and emptiness. The discussion about authority and posture in worship reveals a profound psychological point. Human beings desire equal value, something God has already guaranteed, but they also desire absolute autonomy, which is spiritually impossible. The soul wants to decide how to worship, when to worship, and in what way to worship, as if God were a guest and not the owner of the house. Paul confronts this elegantly, showing that even the visible structure of worship needs to reflect inner humility. It's not about oppression, but about spiritual identity. The outward posture is not to please people, but to reveal that the heart has understood its place in the divine purpose. And this dismantles the silent pride that many carry, the need to express freedom without considering the spiritual meaning of the environment. True worship never arises from rebellion, but from surrender. Never from opinion, but from recognition. Never from ego, but from the awareness that God is greater than any human expression. But the most profound point arises when Paul speaks about the Lord's Supper. The table that should express unity, equality, and sacrifice became a stage for inequality, selfishness, and indifference. The rich ate until they were full. The poor had nothing to eat. The privileged arrived first and celebrated for themselves. The others were humiliated by their absence. The Lord's Supper, the ultimate symbol of Jesus giving himself, was transformed into an empty ritual where everyone thought only of themselves. This reveals the greatest spiritual tragedy of the human soul, the capacity to participate in sacred things with a completely profane heart. Physical presence at the table did not signify spiritual awareness of the cross. External communion did not reflect inner communion, and Paul exposes this wound directly, showing that participating in the Lord's Supper without discerning the body is to drink judgment upon oneself. Not because God seeks to punish, but because the soul that loses its sense of reverence becomes sick inside. The Lord's Supper was never just bread and cup. It is memory, it is covenant, it is a mirror, it is confrontation. When he repeats Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," he's not reciting a rite but restoring meaning. The soul that does not understand meaning transforms mysteries into habits, and habits without understanding breed hardness. The communion table is not an isolated symbolic moment. It is the living reminder of a God who made himself small, who bled, who gave himself up, who humbled himself out of love. How can anyone approach this table with arrogance, haste, or indifference? That is why Paul states that many were weak, sick, and some had even fallen asleep. Not because God punished them, but because the soul that treats the sacred with banality loses spiritual vitality. Sickness here is a symbol of disconnection. Weakness is a symbol of indifference. Death is a symbol of the spiritual anesthesia that invades those who become so accustomed to the divine presence that they no longer perceive it. The Lord's Supper exposes not only our faith, but our emotional maturity before God. The most crucial point of the entire exhortation is this: God disciplines so that we may not be condemned with the world. Divine discipline does not spring from anger, but from wounded love. It does not spring from frustration, but from care. It does not spring from contempt, but from a desire to restore. When God confronts, He is saving. When God reveals, He is healing. When God exposes, He is liberating. Discipline is not a sign of rejection, but of belonging. The soul that understands this ceases to flee from correction and begins to embrace it as a process of maturation. The Lord's Supper is not a morbid memorial, but a living gesture of God saying, "Remember who you are. Remember the price that was paid. Remember the body to which you belong." And when this truth penetrates deeply, arrogance dissolves, comparison loses its power, division disappears, and the heart burns again with reverence. To understand the Lord's Supper is to understand the cross. To understand the cross is to understand identity. To understand identity is to understand the spiritual life in its entirety. This passage reveals that authentic worship requires three attitudes that no mature soul can avoid: reverence, unity, and awareness. Reverence because we are before the Holy One. Unity because we are before the body. Awareness because we are before the sacrifice. Worship is not an event, it is posture. It is not an environment, it is heart. It is not style, it is understanding. And when the soul enters the presence of God with true humility, vanity loses its place, haste loses its value, superficiality loses its meaning. This is how worship becomes healing. This is how communion becomes transformation. This is how the spiritual environment ceases to be ritual and becomes a real encounter with the living Christ. There are moments in the spiritual journey when God confronts the deepest illusion we carry, the idea that we were called to stand out individually. And when Paul addresses spiritual gifts, he is not merely organizing manifestations of grace. He is dismantling vanity disguised as spirituality. The church was fascinated with extraordinary gifts, especially the gift of tongues, as if this were proof of maturity or closeness to God. But Paul reveals that the soul that seeks recognition through its gifts has lost their purpose. Gifts were not created to display power, but to display Christ. They were not given to elevate individuals, but to build up the community. The soul that transforms the gift into a spotlight lives in constant comparison, always measuring its relevance by the reaction of others, always anxious to impress, always hungry for applause that never satisfies. Paul exposes this mechanism with spiritual and psychological precision. The pursuit of prominence is a symptom of insecurity, not maturity. Those who know who they are in God don't need to prove anything to anyone. Paul's recollection of who they were before faith exposes another intimate aspect of the soul. He says that before, they were led by false spiritual impulses, chaotic emotions, and disordered practices. This recollection is not meant to shame, but to show that even spiritual manifestations need to be discerned, because not everything that seems spiritual comes from God. The wounded soul can confuse emotion with revelation, intensity with depth, euphoria with anointing. Paul restores balance by reminding us that the true sign of the Holy Spirit is not the gift, but the sincere and transformative confession that Jesus is Lord. A soul can speak in tongues and still be far from God, but no one can truly call Jesus Lord without the Spirit having made his dwelling within them. This destroys spiritual pride and reveals that gifts do not define maturity. The Lordship of Christ does. And when the soul understands this, the inner environment is reorganized. The gift ceases to be proof of worth and becomes an instrument of service. In presenting the diversity of gifts, Paul touches on an essential psychological point. God does not distribute gifts equally because he does not distribute purposes equally. Each person receives what is necessary to fulfill their part in the whole. But the soul that has not yet matured sees the difference as injustice. It desires what the other has, envies what it has not received, and minimizes what has been entrusted to it. This attitude reveals a heart that has not yet understood that the Creator never gives gifts without giving meaning. And Paul, as a spiritual teacher, reveals the divine harmony behind the diversity. He shows that each manifestation comes from the same Spirit, that each service comes from the same Lord, that each operation comes from the same God. This threefold unity confronts individualism and heals comparison. The gift is not about who receives it, but about who distributes it. Maturity is born when the soul stops competing and begins to cooperate. When this happens, the gift finally finds its original purpose: to edify, heal, comfort, guide, and enlighten. The metaphor of the body is the most powerful revelation of this teaching. Paul describes not only a spiritual organism, but an emotional and psychological model for all human relationships. The body is one, but the members are many, and none of them can tell the other that it is unnecessary. This exposes the pride of those who consider themselves too important to need others, and exposes the pain of those who consider themselves too small to make a difference. Paul reveals that both perceptions are false and unhealthy. The proud soul needs to learn humility. The insecure soul needs to learn self-worth. God placed each member where He wanted, and this heals comparison, resentment, and feelings of insignificance. The eye cannot be heard, the foot cannot be a hand, not because they are weak, but because they are essential in what they are. The body is only healthy when each part fulfills its function without envy, without arrogance, without competition. When someone tries to be what they are not, the body becomes ill. When someone accepts who they are, the body flourishes. The most disconcerting revelation is that the weakest parts are indispensable. God inverts human logic and exalts what society despises. The least visible members receive greater honor. The least celebrated receive greater care. The spiritual community is not structured like stages and audiences, but like nerves, muscles, and bones. All vital, all necessary, all linked by the same Spirit. This profoundly confronts the modern mentality, which values what appears and ignores what sustains. In God's eyes, the one who prays in secret is as important as the one who preaches from the pulpit. The one who serves in silence is as essential as the one who prophesies in public. The soul that understands this stops seeking applause and begins to seek depth, stops competing for visibility and begins to compete for love, stops desiring recognition and begins to desire spiritual relevance, the kind that only heaven sees. This is the environment where gifts flourish without becoming weapons of vanity. The conclusion of this reflection brings a question that pierces the soul. Are they all the same? The answer is no, and thank God for that. Uniformity destroys the beauty of creation. Diversity is God's signature. But Paul, in listing apostles, prophets, teachers, miracles, healings, tongues, interpretations, and governments, shows that each function is a piece of a much greater work. No gift is complete on its own. No person is complete in isolation. The soul that tries to live independently is denying the very structure of the kingdom. We are made to depend on, cooperate with, love, and complement one another. And when Paul affirms that there is a still more excellent way, he is saying that gifts are not the pinnacle of faith. They are merely tools. The pinnacle is love. And this destroys any spiritual pride. A person may have all the gifts, but if they do not have love, their impact will be null before God. Everything that shines without love fades quickly, but everything that serves with love remains for eternity. There are times when God not only confronts us, but dismantles us, and few truths do this as profoundly as the revelation that all the gifts, talents, sacrifices, and efforts we display lose value if they are not sustained by love. The human soul is an expert at building spiritual masks, taking refuge in impressive abilities and exalting capabilities that provoke admiration. But love, when revealed in its pure form, unmasks all that is appearance and reveals what we truly are. When someone speaks in tongues, prophesies accurately, knows profound mysteries, or manifests faith capable of moving mountains, the world is impressed. But when this is done without love, heaven is not impressed. The sound is empty, the work is hollow, the impact is illusory. The soul that seeks recognition through gifts is trying to fill a wound that only love can heal. That is why Paul begins by destroying the illusion. Without love, even the extraordinary becomes useless. The depth of this teaching lies not in the beauty of poetry, but in the brutality of truth. Love is not romantic, not emotional, not a feeling that appears when everything is going well. Love is a decision forged in the fire of daily renunciation. It is patient when the soul wants to give up. It is kind when the mind wants to retaliate. It refuses to envy even when the heart feels it deserves more. It does not boast, does not show off, does not build stages for others to admire it. Love is not easily irritated, does not keep wounds as trophies, does not nurture grudges as if they were justifications for remaining cold. Love does not celebrate selfish victories, does not find pleasure in seeing the other fall, does not rejoice when the truth is distorted, even if this favors the one who distorts it. It protects when it would be easier to abandon. It trusts when everything seems unstable. It waits when time seems cruel. It endures when the burden seems beyond human strength. When this love enters, everything changes, because it reveals who is truly alive inside. A soul that tries to live without love becomes heavy, full of inner tensions and marked by invisible battles that slowly corrode its spiritual sensitivity. It may be active, talented, disciplined, and admired, but inside it remains dry. That is why Paul says that love never fails, not because life is predictable or because relationships are easy, but because love is the only force capable of traversing human frailty without being corrupted. Prophecies end because they are temporary. Knowledge passes because it is limited. Gifts cease because they are tools for a journey that has not yet reached its final destination. Love remains because it is the essence of God, and everything that is born of God carries eternity within itself. The soul that loves is never small, never fragile, never useless, even when the world calls it so. Love transforms even suffering into meaning and even renunciation into glory. Paul reveals that everything we see and experience now is partial. The soul knows only fragments, interprets only reflections, sees only shadows. And this recognition should destroy the pride of anyone who considers themselves spiritually superior. Even the greatest gifts are only glimpses of what we cannot yet fully comprehend. Human vision is imperfect, human understanding is incomplete, human perception is limited. But when the fullness of God is revealed, everything that is partial today will disappear. And that is why gifts are like childhood tools, important, useful, necessary, but still transitory. Spiritual maturity is not about collecting gifts, but about abandoning the need to prove something through them. A child speaks to be heard, but an adult speaks to edify. A child seeks attention, but an adult seeks purpose. The transition between spiritual childhood and maturity is marked not by the gift one possesses, but by the love one practices. When Paul emphasizes the permanence of faith, hope, and love, he is pointing to three pillars that sustain the spiritual journey. Faith is the strength that allows us to continue when everything threatens to crumble. It makes the soul move forward even when it doesn't see the way. Hope is the anchor that prevents the heart from sinking in times of darkness. It keeps perspective alive when the present is confusing. But love is greater than both because faith and hope exist only to lead us to love. Faith leads us to God, hope keeps us in God, but love makes us like God. It is the final mark of spiritual transformation. It is the seal that identifies those who walk in maturity. It is the silent testimony that convinces, heals, and edifies more than any speech. When love dominates the soul, nothing else needs to compete for space. Faced with this portrait, the soul is confronted with an inevitable question. What truly moves us? Because we can serve without loving, we can preach without loving, we can help without loving, we can advise without loving, we can sing without loving, we can even suffer without loving, and none of this will have eternal value. But when love becomes the source, everything changes. Service ceases to be a burden and becomes a privilege. Renunciation ceases to be humiliation and becomes adoration. Forgiveness ceases to be weakness and becomes power. Sacrifice ceases to be pain and becomes an offering. Love not only improves what we do, it purifies who we are. It not only transforms actions, it transforms intentions. And when intentions are transformed, everything around begins to flourish with a beauty that only exists where God truly dwells. If this journey through 1 Corinthians has touched you in any way, whether it has confronted, healed, awakened, aligned, or strengthened your faith, leave a statement in the comments that seals what God has begun in you. Write, "I choose to live the love that transforms everything." When you write this, you are not just interacting with a video. You are witnessing before heaven and reminding your own heart that you have been called to a deeper, more humble, more mature life, filled with love that never fails. And every time someone reads their statement, another soul is encouraged to take the same step. So write, bear witness. Let God use even your words in the comments to edify others. Because love is not just felt, love is lived. If this journey through Paul's letter has touched something within you, an old wound, a silent confusion, a hidden pride, a thirst that never seems to be quenched, then don't let this movement die here. Something within you has been called, confronted, or awakened, not by human rhetoric, but by the Spirit that still searches the depths of the heart. If during this reading you realize that you need to return to the cross, reorganize your priorities, abandon old illusions, break free from spiritual immaturity, or simply yield what you can no longer carry alone, so let this be recorded not as a comment, but as a pact. Write in the comments, "I choose to live the transformation that the Spirit began in me." When you write this, you're not just reacting to content. You are sealing a decision in the spiritual world, declaring that He no longer wants to live divided on the inside, recognizing that the cross needs to occupy the center again, allowing God to finish what He started, and inspiring others to find the courage to do the same. Because testimony isn't about performance, it's about healing. And sometimes a simple public gesture opens doors that the soul has kept locked for years. So write, bear witness, declare. Allow what God began in this text to continue, transform into movement in a direction in real life. And may your choice ignite hope in someone who reads and thinks, if he had the courage, maybe I can too. Right now, I choose to live the transformation that the Spirit began in me and let heaven do the rest.